All right, guys. I thought this would probably be the most interesting and the most boring lecture that we have during our course. Most interesting, obviously, you see me sitting here. I'm in beautiful sunny Florida today by the good graces of my in-laws. We are vacationing with my family. Needless to say, again, thanks to them, that's the only reason we were able to come. Now, on the other aspect, the reason this will probably be the most boring lecture is because I'm going to read a paper. Now, having said that, I think that you guys will have some good interaction from listening to this paper, because it talks about exactly what we're going through in regards to epistemology. That is, how do we know what we know? And of course, we're coming from that angle, from the Thomistic account, obviously, Thomistic realism. Now, what we've looked at thus far, though not in depth, is what we would call rationalism and empiricism. Now, rationalism is something that we looked at in regards to, say, Descartes, where he starts in the mind and he tries to work from the mind to reality, and how we saw that really started to create all sorts of problems when you toss out classical philosophy and some of the metaphysics that go along with that. Now, so who we're going to look at a little tonight or today, depending on what time you're viewing this, will be David Hume. And Hume results, his epistemology results in a radical skepticism as well, except he doesn't begin with rationalism, he begins with empiricism. Now remember, rationalism is supposed to be what we can figure out here, these axioms, these fundamental, undeniable or clear and distinct ideas, as Descartes would call them, and then you work to what you know from those. Empiricism, as you may already know, is what we can verify. Well, we will say it this way: Hume's empiricism, David Hume's empiricism, a very hard type of empiricism, is what you can verify with your five senses, what you can see, what you can hear, what you can taste, smell, touch, those sorts of things. And if something's not true, or if you can't verify something via those methods, then it's just nonsense to talk about them. And then Hume, and again, because this is an intro course, unfortunately we don't have time to get in depth into that, but Hume is essentially going to argue that that's really all you have contact with, is what you can verify with the senses. And this is where later logical positivism and scientism has you can find some roots of that here. Hopefully, again, if some of you guys are listening, please go back and check out that Why Scientism Fails in the link that we listed previously last week, about where William and Craig talks about that. Less than 5 minutes, completely worth it, and you really need to check that out. So having said that, we're going to talk about Hume's problem, quote unquote, of induction. And induction is simply the way we put things together, the causal relationships that we know. So for instance, you put the ice on the burner on the stove, and the burner causes it, the heat causes the ice to melt. Now Hume is going to argue that we really don't have any justification for knowing that the causal relationship there, that it's actually the heat that's what's causing the ice to melt. Hume is going to say, a lot of people mistake Hume and say that Hume denies causality. Hume doesn't deny causality. He thinks that things have causes, but his argument is more subtle and harder to deal with, in the sense that Hume thinks that we can't really have justification for knowing causal relationships. And he says this because he says there's no logical contradiction in saying that. For instance, his classic example is that there's no logical contradiction in imagining uh, when you light a match, that when you touch the flame, that it's cool and soothing. Now, of course, we don't experience that. That's not what Hume's point is. Hume's point is that when you say that when you can light a match, and you can imagine, or you can conceive, as Hume would probably try to argue, that you can conceive it being cool and a soothing, soft feel. He says there's no logical contradiction there. It's not like saying you can imagine a square circle, is what Hume is trying to say, because those things would be logically contradictory to one another. Now, again, unfortunately, we can't go into the depth that we would need to go to into why Hume is going to argue that. But this paper that I'm about to read is going to touch on some of these things and kind of help us push through this last little week on epistemology. And of course, this is coming strongly from the classical and Thomistic angle here. And so with that said, we're going to look at this, and this is going to come for the most part from the an overview of David Hume's problem of induction. So if right now you're still a little tangled up, and wait a minute, what do you mean by induction? What do you mean about? Hopefully that'll if you just hang in there, that this will come to make a little more sense as you pay attention, as you hold on, as you hold tight, and listen to what's going on here. So the problem of induction has become something of an intellectual plague upon the philosophical community for the last few hundred years. And it is because of this significant amount of time that the apparent problem has become accepted as just that, an actual problem. Yet, what if there was no such thing? What if there was no such problem as it relates to induction? Suppose that it be quite possible were the foundations, the root of the initial issue examined, that the alleged problem was actually born of the philosophical missteps of an individual. Suppose that the issue at hand owes much of, if not most of, the supposed problem of induction to a plump Scotsman, David Hume, as we've mentioned. Now, having said as much, it may provide something of benefit to roughly outline the thinking of Hume as it pertains to induction. But even more, it is quite true to say that one may begin with John Locke, even before one turns his sights upon the work of Hume. And one could perhaps go as far back as Descartes. Yet this essay, what I'm reading now, will just limit itself in that sense. We're not going to go back to Descartes, at least I don't think, if I can recall when I wrote this. So then one ought to begin with Locke's teaching. And again, you're asking, who is John Locke? Don't worry, this is about to explain some of that. So then one ought to begin with Locke's teaching that, to oversimplify by quite a bit, and this is tricky, here's a quote, "The thing I know not what." Now this is Locke's term for the external existing thing of the external world. Locke would say this thing that I know not what has a certain power. Again, sorry for using these, silly little things, but hey, it's a paper, and it's just how it is. So he would say, Locke says, the thing I know not what has a certain power to cause impressions on the human mind. So basically that sense data that's hitting your mind, those are the impressions. And it was by these impressions or perceptions that one might gain knowledge of an external world. However, it's only, listen to this, however, it is only these impressions to which one has access. No man can know the thing in itself. Merely the idea of the thing as impressed upon him. Did you catch that? So Locke would say, however, it's only the impressions to which one has access. No man can know the thing in itself, merely the idea of the thing as impressed upon you. So Hume believes that Locke is onto something. However, Hume is also more than ready to extend Locke's observations to their disastrous but logical conclusions. The first, and ought not be wildly controversial to a Thomist, save a tweak of wording, is simply that all of one's knowledge is gained through experience. Now again, classical philosophy, Thomistic philosophy would say, we wouldn't say there's anything necessarily controversial at all. We would say that yes, we gain all of our knowledge through, it comes through the senses first, then there's an immaterial aspect that's involved as well. Hume, they deny the immaterial aspect. It's just all, again, hard empiricism. So However, Hume is also more than ready to extend Locke's observations to their disastrous but logical conclusions. The first, and again, as we said already, it ought not be wildly controversial to a Thomist to say that one's knowledge is gained through experience, that it begins there. Yet, with an already radical turn, the result being that Hume believes all that is available is merely the rapid flow of sense impressions. Recall Locke's teaching of how we know anything external to ourselves, those sense impressions. But notice what the result must be if true knowledge is limited merely to these sense impressions, and those things true by which the predicate is contained within the subject by definition. And that'll be addressed in a moment. We'll address that in a moment. Now, Locke has already planted the notion that the thing I know not what cannot be known in itself. Why? Well, because again, all you have access to are the impressions of that, the sense data of that. And therefore, Hume draws the connection that were a thing to even possess a nature or an essence. Of course, this is what we would want to say in classical philosophy. Hume draws the connection that were a thing to even possess such a thing as a nature or essence, one could not even in principle have any access to any knowledge of it, as one is limited to the impressions. So if that's true, that all you have access to are the impressions, Hume is saying that you can't get to that nature, that essence of the thing. So, and if Hume is concerned with logical connections, and if knowing a thing's nature or essence, which is apparently impossible, would open the possibility for one to know logical connections a priori, that is beforehand, according to just what the thing's telos or directedness or goal-orientedness is, then one is able to make the necessary logical connection for true inductions. Yet this is exactly that which no individual has any access, according to Hume. One may now see as to where Hume is leading. So you see, the point is that if Hume says we can't see a nature or an essence or thing of a thing because all we have is this sense, these perceptions, he says if we can't see that, if we can't touch that nature or that essence, well, we'll just get there. I won't jump ahead here. As a direct result, therefore, according to Hume, the only real knowledge that one may possess comes in two forms: the relation of ideas and matters of fact. The relation of ideas is simply that upon inspection, something is true if it is logically connected to its predicate, such as bachelors are married men, or 1 + 1 = 2. Hume's matters of fact are those truths that can be empirically verified by the senses, such as a woman is standing before me, or there's a palm tree over here. Unfortunately for Hume, his theory of knowledge does not fit into either category, yet that is mentioned above concerning foundations will be addressed later. Remember, go back to week 1, law of non-contradiction, hold that in your head. Now, moving on, this is exactly the point at which Hume thus argues. It is only by, quote, it is only by means of cause and effect that we may go beyond the evidence for our memory and sense in making judgments about matters of fact, end quote. For instance, he claims that were a man to receive a letter from a friend in France, the man assumes that the letter presented before him with a postmark from France is actually from France. Why does he think this? Because his prior experiences have told him that there's a connection between these two matters of fact. Postmarks from France and things postmarked from France result from coming from France. Or were a machine to be observed on an island, man must have left it, as prior experience has revealed that only man makes machines. Hume then makes the point that it is, quote, constantly supposed that there's a connection between the present fact and that which is inferred from it. He's saying the reason you think that these causal relationships exist is just simply because of your experience, just over and over and over and over again. But that doesn't mean it comes from that. You just have seen that over and over and again. So that's his point there. Now, Hume goes on to argue that were this connection shown to be illusory, in the sense that these supposed connections are but habit and custom, again, just you've always seen it that way, then if it can be shown that they're illusory in any real logical sense, then there would be no rational basis for accepting these supposed cause and effect connections. And as mentioned above, this is exactly what Hume is going to try to do here. This relation of cause and effect strikes at the very core, the very heart of induction. That is putting it rather lightly. Of course, one might object that it is not accurate to say that cause and effect are identical to all forms of induction. For instance, one might arguably draw a distinction between the following two instances. One, car after car after car after car, etc., of the same color travel along a parade route. Well, they would lead one to believe, or lead you towards the belief, that the next car will also be the same color. And two, that's one type of what we might think of an instance of induction. And two, that of sexual relations, which seem to tend towards the production of a child. One's natural inclination is to say that the two examples are not exactly comparable as the same, in the same sense, or as the same sense of cause and effect is not at play among both examples. However, this is exactly, get this now, however, this is exactly what Hume argues in regard to the human perspective. These two examples are in the same relation, as both examples are merely inductive. For instance, Hume would say, just like you think the next car might be a whatever color, because you've seen car after car after car after car after car after car of the same color go by in the parade, you would think that the next one would be that color. He'd say, but that's exactly why when we talk about the real logical connections between cause and effect, that's the only reason you think that the sexual relationship is what produces a child. Maybe it does, but how do you know that's not just like seeing car after car after car? You're just saying that because you've seen it this way for so long. See how radical this is? So, according to Hume's principle, the cause and effect relationship of sex producing children is apparently no more logically necessary than one car being the same color as the preceding cars on the parade route, or at least the individual's ability to know the true causal logical connection. Logical necessity is Hume's point. It is within this sense that the problem of induction must be understood. Of course, this quite obviously strips this common sense understanding of cause and effect. Voila! Humanity has now been blessed with what we've been talking about, or the problem of induction. Naturally, this radical theory of epistemology has many devastating and obvious consequences to knowing and much else. But this point about knowing in relation to the discipline of science is assuredly worth musing upon. Assuredly, how'd you like that? But this point about knowing in relation to the discipline of science is assuredly worth musing upon, and may serve as an off-ramp, so to speak, into a possible alternative to Hume's somewhat accepted contribution, to use the term loosely there. Put rather roughly, it might be stated that, quote, science is the search for causes. Francis Bacon is usually accredited with that, with making that statement. Now, if this is an acceptable premise, then this is the very principle that is explicitly assumed under the methodology of the scientist's toolkit, the scientific method. The method assuming that an individual may form a hypothesis and by the result of experiments based upon causal relationships come to a knowledge of how or why things act as they do and can be assumed to act the same way in the future, all things being equal. Now, juxtapose this grand assumption with David Hume's problem of induction. Think about that for a minute. If Hume is denying that you can know cause and effect, justified reason to have cause and effect, then what does this do for a discipline that relies on knowing the connections between cause and effect? All right, so now at the moment, the issue is none other than the result upon just how one is to understand science if causal relationships are unknowable. Aside from answers that concern themselves with merely the pragmatic benefits of the discipline, aside from that, which it seems is the only viable option if one concedes the argument to Hume, one must ponder just what is left for the scientists that had assumed that they were gaining real and true knowledge of the way things are, real and true knowledge of the ways of the world. Seems to be a problem. It would seem that even the concept of truth itself must be confined to, as mentioned, some theory just resting upon pragmatic concerns, or radical subjectivism that must abandon any hope for the discovery of objective truth in the sense of the traditional correspondence theory. So, meaning that if one can never attain knowledge of the ontological reality between an effect and its cause, then now the scrap heap of the discipline, well, that's what it is. It's now the scrap heap of the discipline of science is rather useless, again, in the sense of any objective knowledge. It is literally undone as a discipline of exact knowledge in any meaningful sense of the word as it pertains to the correspondence theory of truth. You may need to go back to module 1 to recall correspondence theory there. Remember, just that whatever the statement is, whatever the proposition is, whatever the judgment is, actually corresponds to something out there in reality. So in that sense, science may still be usable in that it helps to identify things that work, or these describing things that we see, but it really wouldn't know if what it's saying is actually describing the world as it is, the ontological status of something out there is what it's saying there. So on the other hand, back to the paper now. On the other hand, suppose that one simply concedes the point to Hume, even realizing the full implication for science as is naturally understood. Suppose that the individual has no qualms with abandoning all of his past understanding of what it means, or what it meant for science to attain the, quote, truth of the workings of the world, as well as the universe. He now readily admits that truth must be merely concerned with the pragmatic, or trapped within a radical subjectivism, i.e., something like Stephen Hawking's remarks that no theory of the universe is any more true than another, quote, so long as it works and is consistent, end quote. What might one say? The classical philosopher has an argument in waiting for such a problem, and we would say lunacy. Now, metaphysically, it is simply self-defeating to hold to the position that truth is that which works, or no theory of the universe is objectively true, as those very statements must be true regardless as to if they work or not, and they must be objectively true themselves. And the former must be false if it is true when it does not necessarily work, and even lies work in this sense. So again, we'll go back to the law of non-contradiction there. Remember, I told you this is that principle is going to follow you through almost everything we do in this course. One of the most important things that you really get a grasp on there. And the latter is true if true is false and need not be bothered with. But perhaps just as damning is that both statements must necessarily depend upon the correspondence theory. Think about that. But perhaps just as terrible for those is that both of those statements must necessarily depend upon the correspondence theory being true, as they must be describing the way in which reality is. The other option, radical subjectivism, will be addressed further down. But perhaps these are not truly the only two options. Perhaps objectivity in science and cause and effect can be salvaged by Immanuel Kant's solution. Now, have we talked about Kant thus far? Not really. This is why we're cramming all of these epistemological issues into these last week and this week. First, again, last week, mainly skepticism, and this week, try to round it out a little more with Hume, Kant, some of these other epistemologies that result in, really, you don't really know a whole lot. So, having said that, Kant he thinks Hume's onto something here. Man, this guy's really got a good point. What can we do? So Kant tries to offer something of a solution. So we need to look at that. It is not the intention of this essay, of course, to offer a full critique of Kant, yet a brief mention must be made for the obvious reason that if Kant is correct, then the problem of induction is solved. And a solution to the alleged problem is exactly that which is being solved. So Kant desperately tries to rescue the objective truths of science. This was his first and foremost goal, especially with the great success of Newtonian physics blossoming within his time. Now, Kant wants to do this by providing a middle path, so to speak, that will provide room for the objectivity of science and supposedly faith, but that is another matter. Now, on the side of Locke and Hume, Kant agrees that all knowledge comes by experience, but that it is not only by experience. The mind is not passive in the way that sense impressions are received. The mind acts on all these sense impressions from an assumed external reality, and that there are categories, as Kant says, Kant calls them categories, within all human minds that form one's ideas in systematic and an orderly fashion. Apparently, this is supposed to salvage the objectivity of knowledge, as these categories are universal and objective in their scope, and that all minds share them. Now, also salvaging the universal claims of empirical sciences and Newtonian physics. Now, the ways in which one may know are by analytic judgments, says Kant, parallel to Hume's relation of ideas. Remember these logically necessary things. And synthetic judgments, parallel to Hume's matters of fact. And a priori and a posteriori types of knowledge. Now, from this, Kant also goes on to propose that, with little opposition, there are a priori analytic judgments, and yet very arguably a priori synthetic judgments, in which something such as the law of causality would fit, or Kant's famous example of 7 + 5 = 12, meaning that's true by definition, but you don't get that until you experience that sort of stuff afterwards, after experience. Now, at this point, some serious questions may be raised. In fact, I hope I didn't just read that backwards there. Anyway, let's keep going. Kant states that the noumenal, the external, this is noumenal is Kant's word for the external world. Kant states that the noumenal external world is out there, yet one can have no knowledge of anything in regard to it beyond our perception, via the forms by which our mind forces upon the raw data. The phenomenal world. And again, so the phenomenal world is Kant's jargon for what's going on in here, what's going on in the mind. So you've got the noumenal, which Kant says is the external reality world, and the phenomenal world, what's going on in here. Now, again, this is because the mind, like an empty jelly jar, takes in the data and forms it to itself, just as a jelly jar is formed to or the jelly is formed to the structure of whatever kind of jar it goes in. Now, however, it's quite difficult to believe that this very point, there's not a glaring contradiction here. We got to just go ahead and look at immediately. So, in Kant's teaching, it seems that the forms of the categories, again, he said there's categories such as law of causality or time and space, or time relationships, causal relationships, all those sorts of things. Those are what constitute the categories. In fact, he has 12 of them. Now, think about this. I'm even going to say this part over again. However, it is quite difficult to believe that this very point is not a glaring contradiction to Kant's teaching that the forms and categories are limited to our own minds, simply because if the above is true, then cause and effect are not construct of our own minds, as the external world must be an exterior causal relationship between the external things and those perceptions that they give off, so to speak. The external world is putting off or causing us to perceive raw data. Moreover, if our own minds are what give us the impression, if our own minds are what give the impression of cause and effect, something that is supposedly not true of the nominal world, then how can Kant know? How can Kant know that there are any external things that are causing representations? You catch that? So, moreover, if one's own mind is that which give the impressions of cause and effect, something that is supposedly not true or cannot be known of the noumenal external world, then how can Kant know that there is any external thing that is causing a representation at all? Now, perhaps Kant's approach may work from another angle. Kant teaches that these supposed universal truths are actual in the sense that they are the result of a priori truths, again, which are supposed to account for these universal and objective type truths. Simply put, Kant postulates that the individual has implanted his nod to the rationalists, forms, categories that we find our experiences poured into simultaneously as one contacts the world. And these result in our thinking in terms of cause, space, time, subject, relation, etc. Now, roughly, these are inescapable as we experience the noumenal external world, the world as is, so to speak. And though Kant argues that all possess these a priori forms, notice that this world as is untouchable by any individual or his senses. Kant argues that since we all must communicate using these a priori concepts, as if we did not possess them, then we could not interact at all. Perhaps this rescues true objectivity and true objective causal knowledge. Now, this seems dubious. In fact, I like just to say that again because it sounds cool. This seems dubious. This seems dubious at the outset, as how could one know if one could or could not communicate with another, if it is supposedly a given that there's no way by which to test the assertion? Perhaps one could not, but perhaps one could. There would be no truly objective criteria to evaluate such an assertion on this view. But let's leave that and concede his point for sake of argument. At best, it would still seem to boil down to a pragmatic form of argument, concluding that if it works, therefore it is true. But of course, because this or that may not work, does not mean that it's true at all, as demonstrated above. Now, again, just for something you may want to look at here, I think it's even in your Does the Center Hold textbook, which again, I told Bernadette last week that it's not Christocentric by any stretch of the word, but it has a sampling of this argument here. So if you want to look at something while just because it works, doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. You can check out an additional argument that I would say destroys that kind of view by Alvin Plantinga, called it. It's his evolutionary argument against naturalism. So it seems that Kant wants to have his cake and eat it too. And consider Kant's point that the distinction of that judgments of perception merely regard only with what we sense or intuit, while judgments of experience regard what we infer from our perceptions. We cannot dispute judgments of perceptions because they are wholly subjective. One cannot inform another a rock did not seem gray to him. We can dispute judgments of experience as they are meant to be objective. One can inform him the rock was not gray. But just who, if one cannot get beyond our perceptions, is to hold to the objective standard by which we must judge these perceptions. Now, perhaps Kant would be happy to concede as much on his view. If this is the case, then it would seem that objective and universal truths, and as our concern, true and objective causal connections, are only as much in name only. There are no objective and universal truths regarding the world as is, the external world, that can actually even be known. On this understanding and account, it seems that one must simply pass on Kant's efforts to salvage truly objective knowledge of cause and effect, without simply redefining what anyone actually even means by the term objective. Now, and consider that Kant's understanding in regard to the real or noumenal world involves the 12 categories used or imposed by all human minds. Yet on the limitation of perception, how does one know if there really are other human minds? In fact, even conceding that there are other human minds, what grounding could Kant offer in the highly unlikely event as to why literally all people share these categories? As mentioned above, the because it works argument just seems dubious. And finally, and most importantly, Kant's entire system, his massive implication is that when one cannot know reality as it is. Now, that's self-defeating, right? That seems to be the implication. It doesn't come out and say something like that, but that seems to be the implication. But if that's the case, then again, that's self-defeating. For instance, to ask Kant if one can know the baseball bat directly in front of him, or from, in my instance here, this palm tree or whatnot, if I can know the palm tree directly in front of me, then Kant must answer, if he's to be consistent, that the individual, that I cannot know that the bat as in itself, or the palm tree in and of itself, but only his perception of the bat. But this, of course, would have Kant claiming exactly what he claims that one cannot know. Namely, Kant would have to know that his system is the truth of reality as it is. In order to say that one could not know reality as it is, one would have to know the metaphysical, overarching, objective truth of reality as it really is. The very foundation seems to be self-defeating. So much for Kant solving the problem of induction. And back to David Hume. So thanks, Kant, but no thanks. Now, the focus must return to Hume, as the rest of Enlightenment philosophy was simply following in his footsteps, following his teaching, his principles, and ideas to their logical and barking mad, I would say, conclusions. Now, if that is true, then one is philosophically and intellectually justified in dismissing his philosophy, upon which gave birth officially to the problem of induction, as well as almost all of the others that used him as their foundation. So again, it is to Hume that we must turn. Now, Hume's teaching does not simply nudge the edge of common sense. Hume's position does radical violence to the notion of common sense. This should be a red flag. Naturally, we are not solely concerned with simple practicality, as is clearly demonstrated by the above critiques on pragmatism. This is philosophy, but one ought, at the very outset, point out any purely practical absurdities when discussing a philosophical point, if for no other reason than at least to draw attention or recognize a red flag that the philosophical position under consideration may perhaps be absurd and untrue. Again, we're saying it is absurd or untrue because of that? No, we're just saying, hey, that may be a warning sign. Now, the position could actually be true. To oppose common notions regarding reality does not at all make a position untrue. That fact has been proven time and time again, but we have reason to doubt its truth in the light of multiple absurdities. For example, is Hume willing to examine the populations of the planet and honestly, intellectually honestly hold that there is no logical or causal connection between sexual intercourse and the production of infants? Now, is Hume willing to be locked into a trunk lacking oxygen and honestly hold that there is no logical causal connection between his very life and the presence of this basic element? Now, to be fair, Hume would rightly say that the above misses the point, and I suppose that one could concede that it does. However, if for no other reason mentioned, I would argue that we're justified, granted it is due to experience, to doubt or question his arguments as well. Therefore, this provides us with more than ample justification to offer counters to his arguments. Again, are we saying they're false because of that? No. We're just saying that this at least gives us justification to say, wait a minute, there may be something screwy with what you're saying here. Now, given the above, and this is a very important point, it is more plausible that one is able to abstract something like a nature, an essence, a universal, which would then entail the desperately sought after necessary logical connections for valid inductions that lead to valid deductions. Or is it more plausible that examples such as the above have no logical connection whatsoever, no matter their constant repetition, even after a millennia of repetition ad nauseum? Now, you've got to make that decision. The following is a way in which Hume brings forth the issue. First, Hume states with multiple examples that we could conceive of objects appearing without any cause whatsoever. Say of a bowling ball appearing on the table out of nothing. You're just sitting there, a bowling ball. Hume is wrong. Now, as Elizabeth Anscombe points out, Hume has desperately confused our imagining a bowling ball appearing on the table, uncaused out of nothing, with conceiving a bowling ball on the table, uncaused out of nothing. Sure, one may imagine that we are happily carrying on our normal daily business when suddenly a ball appears on the table. However, this is nothing close to conceiving that there was no cause to the phenomenon. As Edward Fazer notes, one would of course wonder how such a thing happened, maybe a prank, a magical stunt, a scientific breakthrough displaying teleportation, whatever. Yet no individual would conclude that the object appeared uncaused out of nothing. The last thing one is actually able to do is conceive that it came from nothing, out of nowhere. It just can't be done. Even when in the process of the thought experiment, us doing it right now, one has to actually cause the image to come into being. So even in the thought experiment, there's not a non-causal something appearing because there's no cause. You have to make the thing, your mind, your imagination has to make it pop into being. Or in other words, Descartes accurately reveals the difference between these two principles to be true much before the lifetime of Hume. Descartes, in his Sixth Meditation, states that we cannot imagine a chililogon, which is just a thousand-sided object. We can't imagine that. And again, pay attention here. Descartes is trying to say there's a difference between imagining and conceiving. So what he says is, Descartes says, and again, he says that we cannot imagine a thousand-sided figure but we have no problem of conceiving what a thousand-sided figure is. That is, one has no difficulty conceiving of the concept of a thousand-sided figure, chilogon or whatever, however you pronounce that. But it seems ridiculous to assert that one could imagine an actual thousand figure in his mind that is any different from, say, a figure with 999 sides. How would that look any different to you in your mind? Imagine here maybe a disco ball, the biggest disco ball you've ever seen with the individual little sides of glass there. And I would even say Descartes seems correct there. So clearly then there's an important distinction between the ability to conceive and imagine. And Hume is guilty of charging that we could conceive of such and such a phenomenon when clearly he is truly only justified in claiming that we could imagine the picture of whatever it is. One may also ponder, if Hume is correct, as to just who or what is he trying to convince. For example, seeing as to how Hume believes that the only knowledge that is available is via these rapid flows of sense impressions, one cannot in any way have sense impression of some sort of substance. But if one cannot have any access to any knowledge of some sort of substance, then for Hume, it is simply non-existent. One cannot have knowledge of what one cannot have any access. Therefore, there simply is no substance. This would, of course, entail that if there is no substance, then there is no nature that could reside in a substance. There can be no natures, as there is no substance. This leads to the conclusion that there could be no human nature as well. But if there is no human nature, then there is no self. There is no enduring something that stays or maintains an identity throughout the course of time. You catch that? We just have no access to such a thing via our impressions. And as a minor point concerning the above, Hume must also assume these examples and his work and arguments will cause multiple individuals to accept his conclusions. But why believe there to be any logical connection between his arguments and what the individual comes to believe about them? He might respond that this is not a problem, as it would be in line with his points on relations of ideas, like married bachelors and so on. But this will not work as his flow of argument is not logically necessary in the strict sense that he demands of tautologies and mathematical certainty when he speaks of necessary relation between ideas. No argument he could provide could stand under such demanding criteria, yet he must assume this causal relation or this causal connection all the while. Now, though Hume is tough to refute and clearly brilliant, minor points such as the one just mentioned may not do much more than raise an eyebrow. But perhaps the above idea leads to his foundation. And if so, this could be very troublesome for Hume's system and his supposed problem of induction. Hume states, in what has come to be known as Hume's fork, that, and this is important, this is basically Hume's test for how you can know something. Hume states in what has come to be known as Hume's fork that if we take, quote, if we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school of metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reason concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. Sadly for Hume, catch this, pay attention, sadly for Hume, his epistemology is self-referentially inept. That is to say, it's self-defeating. It defeats itself, as it cannot support its own assertion by which something could be known. Another way to state this would be to point out that Hume's very claim is neither true by definition nor empirically verifiable. Again, go back, listen to that claim again if you have to. Is that true by definition, or is it empirically verifiable? No, it's not. And Hume says if something is true, if you want to know if something's true, it has to be met by one of those two criteria, or both. That statement, his foundation, that statement doesn't meet those. Therefore, if Hume's claim is true, then his claim itself would be false, rendering it utterly meaningless. And of course, if meaningless, then one has no reason to take it seriously in regard to its claim. Moreover, it also seems that an additional statement by Hume concerning cause and effect may be self-defeating. And this, it would seem, should be taken into consideration if one is going to entertain Hume's objections to causal knowledge. Hume claims that, quote, all reasoning concerning matters of fact seems to be founded on the relation of cause and effect. By means of the relation alone can we go beyond the evidence of our memory and senses. But obviously, we must ask if the above concerns a matter of fact or if it stands in relation to cause and effect. Again, clearly itself does neither. However, if it is true that, quote, all reasoning concerning matters of fact seems to be founded on the relation of cause and effect, then it is false, as it leaves open the possibility that there are truths about reasoning concerning matters of fact that are not founded on the relation of cause and effect. On the other hand, if it is true that, quote, all reasoning concerning matters of fact seems to be founded on the relation of cause and effect, then it is false, as this too must be the case, and we have no reason to believe it. But for the time being, the questions and observations that pertain to the practical difficulties will be looked upon once again. As noted above, in regarding the denial of causality, what is one to do with the blatant assumption of Hume concerning his arguments to cause one to accept its conclusions? Or what is one to conclude in that Hume must at the same time and in the same sense assume that he cannot know causal connections while simultaneously knowing that if he performs such and such action, his hand will begin to move, which causes his pen to move, which causes his ink to flow, which causes the formation of letters, which causes the formation of words, which causes sentences, which causes paragraphs, and so on until his argument, again, is read by some individual. Of course, all the causal connections that even allow you to see or hear if he is speaking, so on. Causing the individual to think upon Hume's argument, causing the individual to accept its conclusions, causing the individual to repeat it to his friends ad nauseum, if the reader is not already there by this point. So, of course, the point simply being that Hume must assume all of these causal connections while at the same time asserting that it's not rationally justifiable to assume all those causal connections. Again, it does not prove the point against Hume, yet it all gives serious ground to question his argument regarding causal connections, as it seems they must be in order for Hume's theory against causal knowledge to get off the ground. He has to assume them. Physical, mental, and whatever else causal connections seem to be a self-evident reality. By way of example, Hume simply cannot get around some sort of knowledge claim regarding the causal connections. Even with one of his most famous or infamous examples using the post-hoc fallacy. Remember, the post-hoc fallacy was, oh, well, this happened, so it must be the result of that. And that's considered a fallacy because you're confusing that. It's not necessarily that happened because of this. But here, check out Hume's argument, his example of this. It was Hume that, while trying to provide an example of a false cause is another name we would say for post-hoc fallacy. So it was Hume that, while trying to provide an example of a false cause, declared, quote, just as the sun will rise every morning after the rooster crows, it would be a mistake to believe that the rooster was the actual cause of the sun's rising, though one may have observed this for centuries. What's wrong with that? Hume used this example to reveal that our conclusions concerning cause and effect could be very wrong, though all the while observing one event, the crowing, preceded by another event, a sunrise, for centuries. But check this out. Is it not true that the only way in which Hume's example would work is if Hume has knowledge that the rooster's crow was not the cause? But how would Hume know that it was not the cause if one cannot know the relation between cause and effect? You catch that? Now, one must reconsider the question as stated above. Is it any more plausible that one is able to abstract something like a nature, essence, or universal, which would then entail the desperately sought after necessary logical connections for valid inductions that lead to valid deductions? Or is it more plausible that examples such as the above have no logical connections whatsoever, no matter their repetition, even after a millennia of repetition? Given the fact that Hume's system has multiple difficulties, some even being self-referentially inept and self-defeating, foundationally on their points, it seems much more plausible to accept the traditional understanding of reality. That is, one is able to abstract a nature or universal from objects of being that will provide reasonable and logical connections between cause and effect. This is not to say that the process is infallible. No doubt, people make mistakes in cause-effect relations, but it is only by recognizing a true causal connection that one is able to know that a mistake has been made. As if one could not know, then one could not know that an actual mistake was even made. For instance, the only way in which a student can be told that his math equation is incorrect is if there is an actually correct answer. If one does not know the answer or have an approximate idea of the answer, then how does one know that the student does not, in fact, have the answer. As mentioned above, the remaining option, if Hume's overall philosophy is true, results in a radical and inescapable subjectivism. And therefore, this leads to a very interesting and pertinent question by which the essay will conclude. Does one need an escape route out of subjectivism or a positive argument for the view that one can know an external reality and all of the causal relationships that are taken for granted? Do we know that? Or do we need an escape route from that? It is not so clear that any individual should need such an escape route from subjectivism, so long as he can continue to show that attempts which offer possible defeaters to objective reality and the like can also be offered their own set of defeaters. That is to say, the default view of reality, just in that one can know something about a true and external reality. For instance, you really are reading it or listening to this essay right now, should be the view that one is apt to hold his or her entire life, absent from some philosophical objection that reality cannot be known or justified in any objective sense. Of course, this does not leave one with a proof for objective external reality. This is clearly due to the fact that one must begin with the fact that there is an external world and that there is knowledge to glean from it, natures, universals, etc. But if these opposing arguments can be found to be faulty or especially self-defeating, then one has rational justification to hold to the traditional common sense view that one knows the outside world from which truths such as cause and effect may be gleaned. That is to say, in the absence of an airtight, irrefutable argument that outside reality cannot be known, the fact that humans seem to experience external reality with its causes, effects, etc., and this being an understatement, will always serve as a stronger premise, so to speak, within any argument, conscious or subconscious, for an external world than any premise against it. Only if one can provide reason that one should not necessarily, and here the word is to be taken literally in the philosophic sense. If only if one can provide reason that one should not necessarily submit to the conclusions of an argument for subjectivity, then it is more than reasonable to continue to hold to the truth of an external and knowable world. With that said, are there arguments given that provide a defeater to the belief in an external objective world? Sure. We just went through Hume, last week, Descartes' problems that were raised. There are multiple arguments for such a view. However, it also seems that all these arguments boil down to either one of the two claims. Due to our utter dependence on sense perception and or impressions, we can't know the external world, including knowledge of cause and effect relations. Or two, due to our utter dependence on sense perceptions and or impressions, we are not justified in our belief of an external and or objective world, including knowledge of true cause and effect. Notice these are very similar conclusions, yet the second is more difficult to deal with, as it claims to be a little less strong. The first claim is self-refuting. It cannot meet the requirements of its own claim. For instance, if the claim may be worked to convey what is actually saying, this simply means that for every negation, there must be an affirmation. The only way that one may claim one above is if and only if. Hey, we both. All right, here we're doing our little lecture here, and my little boy, his birthday, he just turned 2 today, just ran up right here. So, how does one know that one cannot know the external world? We went through this last week with Descartes, so I'm not going to necessarily read this aspect. Now, the second claim is going to run tantamount something like this. I'm going to read it too so we can get out of here. The second claim is more difficult because it seems less radical. It says we're just not justified in knowing these causal relationships. Now, think about that. It seems to be more humble. It does not say that we cannot know truths concerning the possibility of an external world. It simply says that given the arguments for subjectivity, one is now not justified in holding to the view that truths can actually be known of the possibility of an external and objective world, which would include true knowledge of cause and effect. However, this claim will also end up defeating itself. First, any argument given for the truthfulness of subjectivity of the external world must assume that there are external objects, one other being at the very least, that the arguments are true for. These would necessarily have to be true for all, objectively, if they are true at all. Of course, if the argument is true for all people, places, and time, even if there were just one other, regardless of their own view, then this would be an objective truth and not subjective. Oh, where are we? Okay, one paragraph left. Yes. Now, again, just as a side note, this is why solipsists can never try to argue someone in their position, because if they argue in someone into their position, then there was someone there that they argued into their position, which would make solipsism false. And remember, solipsism is the view that you are the only person that exists in the universe. So, also to say that we do not have justification to hold to an external objective world is simply tantamount to saying this: we do not have any justification for holding any truths or theories of an external objective reality. That's self-defeating. Again, go back over that if you need to hear that again. Of course, that's self-defeating. However, if it's true it's false, then one need not hold to that either, right? It would seem safe to deny that there is a problem of induction, if one must construct his case upon the principles given by David Hume. Not only was it displayed as existentially unviable, but these existential difficulties serve to give justification to even question and analyze the system on its own criteria. And it is by the tools of philosophy and the tools of Hume's own system that reveal serious philosophical and logical difficulties resulting in its collapse. This collapse allows for a possible alternative, and this possible alternative is none other than the former providing justification that an individual may continue to take his initial starting point with an external world and all that may be gleaned from it. So hopefully, speaking in that sense, there is no problem of induction. Now, you guys talk about that, go back over parts you need to. Have a great time. See you live again next week, God willing. Blessings.